Naomi held the crumpled $50 bill in her pocket, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper that represented the difference between life and death for her father. She had spent 5 grueling months starving herself, walking miles instead of taking the bus, and saving every copper penny to buy the specific medicine that would stop her father's lungs from failing. But as she looked at the shivering, elderly couple standing in the doorway of the diner, rejected by a cruel world, she knew she was about to do something reckless. She was about to trade her father's survival for the hunger of 2 strangers. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching tale of sacrifice and unexpected redemption, if you believe that kindness still has a place in this world, please hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter, stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Join our community, and let's bring a little more light into the world together. Now, let's witness the moment that changed everything. Naomi Daniels was only 20 years old, yet she moved through the diner with the heavy, deliberate exhaustion of a woman 3 times her age. The fluorescent Christmas lights strung up in the window blinked erratically, casting a sickly, intermittent glow over the worn vinyl booths and the grease-stained linoleum floor. It was Christmas Eve, a night that was supposed to be filled with warmth and generosity, but inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the sharp, biting chill of despair. Naomi worked the night shift here, scrubbed office floors in the morning, and took whatever delivery gig she could find in the splintered hours between. Her bones ached with a deep, throbbing rhythm that never quite went away, a constant reminder of the relentless grind required just to exist. She didn't hustle because it was glamorous. She hustled because she was terrified. Her father, Leonard, was fading. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing erosion. His lungs were betraying him, turning simple breaths into battles, and the silence in their small apartment grew louder every night, filled only by the rasp of his struggling chest. The clinic had given her a simple, terrifying ultimatum: get the medicine or watch him spiral. The specific brand, the specific dose, it was the only thing that could buy them more time. The cost was $50. To some, $50 was a casual lunch or a forgotten subscription. To Naomi, it was a mountain she had spent 5 months climbing. She kept the money in a cloudy glass jar hidden inside a wool sock under her bed, adding to it with tips, crumpled ones, and coins that she scavenged like treasures. She had denied herself food that smelled good, walked past warm coats in store windows, and ignored the holes in her own shoes. Every sacrifice was a prayer whispered to the universe that she could save the only family she had left. Tonight, the jar finally held the full amount. She had counted it twice on her mattress before her shift, smoothing the bills with a trembling hand, promising herself that tomorrow morning Leonard would breathe easier. But as the diner clock ticked toward 9, the front door swung open, and the freezing wind ushered in a test she wasn't prepared for. 2 elderly strangers stood in the entryway, framed by the swirling snow outside. They were not begging, nor were they chaotic. They simply stood with a quiet, devastating dignity. The man's coat was thin, the fabric worn violently at the elbows, and he stood with a hunch that spoke of a lifetime of carrying heavy things. Beside him, the woman held his arm with a grip that was both supportive and desperate, her thumb rubbing small, soothing circles into his sleeve. They looked like people who had fallen through the cracks of the world, residing in that invisible space between tragedy and survival. Grant, the diner's manager, spotted them instantly. He was a man who wore his cruelty like a badge, dressed in a tight red sweater that mocked the holiday spirit. He marched over, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, his face twisted into a sneer of disgust. "We are full," he barked, his voice slicing through the low murmur of the diners, even though 3 booths sat completely empty near the frosted window. Christmas rush. Paying customers only. You understand? The humiliation in the room was palpable, a physical weight that pressed against Naomi's chest. The elderly woman opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to plead, but then closed it, her eyes dropping to the floor in practiced defeat. The man just nodded, a slow, painful movement, as if he had expected nothing less from the world. A few customers watched with detached curiosity, one man muttering a curse into his coffee, while another chuckled nervously, relieved it wasn't him being cast out. Naomi felt that familiar, sharp pull under her ribs, the same sensation she felt when Leonard pretended he wasn't in pain. She looked at the couple, shivering as they turned back toward the deadly cold, and then she looked at Grant's smug, satisfied back. Her hand brushed her pocket. The $50 burned against her thigh. It was her father's breath. It was 5 months of hunger. It was her entire future. But she couldn't watch them leave. "It's fine," Naomi said, her voice shaking but clear enough to stop the room. "I'll take them." Grant spun around, eyes blazing. "Naomi, don't. I'm not covering a charity case." She ignored him, walking toward the couple and guiding them to the warmest booth in the back, knowing she had just made a decision that might cost her everything. Naomi guided the couple into the booth with a gentleness that seemed out of place in the harsh, fluorescent reality of the diner. The woman looked at her with wide, watery eyes, as if Naomi had just handed her a fragile glass sculpture that might shatter at any moment. They sat slowly, the man's knees cracking audibly as he bent, a sound of dry bones and weary years. Naomi didn't open the menus. She knew they wouldn't order. Instead, she brought them soup, thick, steaming bowls of potato chowder, and a basket of warm bread that smelled of yeast and comfort. They ate with a heartbreaking urgency, spoons scraping the bottom of the bowls, before slowing down as the warmth finally began to seep into their frozen limbs. Naomi watched them from the service station, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't just watching them eat. She was watching her father's medicine disappear, spoonful by spoonful. Every bite they took was $1 she didn't have, a day of breath she was stealing from Leonard. The moral calculus was tearing her apart, but she kept her face smooth, a mask of professional kindness. When the meal was finished, the woman looked up, her face softened by the food and the heat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. We will pay what we can." Naomi shook her head, a tight, painful motion. "Take your time," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. She walked to the register and rang up the bill. It came to $48. The number stared back at her in aggressive black ink. It was almost exactly what she had saved. Grant walked by, pausing just long enough to lean in, his breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "Don't expect a cent from the till," he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "You want to play saint? You pay the price." Naomi swallowed the lump of bile in her throat. She walked to her locker, the metal door screaming on its hinges, and pulled out the mismatched sock. Her hands shook violently as she unfolded the bills. She counted them out, tens, fives, ones, until the sock was empty. She walked back to the register and slid the money into the drawer. The slam of the cash drawer sounded like a gunshot, final and irreversible. She carried the receipt back to the table, placing it face down. "You're all set," she said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack her face. The man looked at her, his gaze intense and piercing, stripping away the waitress uniform to see the frightened girl beneath. "You really looked this time," he said, his voice cryptic and heavy with meaning. The woman reached out and touched Naomi's hand, her skin like dry paper. "You didn't have to," she said, tears finally spilling over. "I know," Naomi replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Christmas." They stood up and left, disappearing into the swirling snow, leaving Naomi standing in the empty booth with nothing but a dirty table and a hollow feeling in her gut. The diner noise rushed back in, clinking silverware, laughter, the sizzle of the grill, as if the universe hadn't just shifted on its axis. Naomi finished her shift in a daze, her body moving on autopilot while her mind screamed in panic. The walk home was brutal. Naomi didn't take the bus. She couldn't afford the fare anymore. The wind cut through her thin jacket, stinging her face and numbing her fingers, but she welcomed the pain. It distracted her from the terrifying conversation she was about to have, or the lie she was about to tell. When she entered the small, drafty apartment, the silence was heavy. Leonard was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, his breathing shallow and rattling. He looked up and smiled, that protective, heartbreaking smile parents give when they don't want their children to worry. "You eat?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah." Naomi lied, looking away. She set her bag down with agonizing slowness. "How are you feeling?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Just dust. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. The cough that followed shook his frail frame, a deep, wet sound that terrified her. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the empty jar under her bed mocking her. She had chosen strangers over her father. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air out of her lungs. 2 days passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. Naomi called the clinic and hung up before anyone answered, too cowardly to admit she didn't have the money. Leonard's condition worsened. His pauses for breath grew longer, his skin taking on a grayish pallor. Naomi went to work like a ghost, moving through the motions, her eyes hollow. Then, during a slow afternoon lull, she found a basket sitting on the counter near her station. It was simple, wrapped in brown paper, filled with oranges and a loaf of bread. Taped to the side was a small envelope. "What's this?" she asked the dishwasher. He shrugged, scrubbing a plate. "Was here when I got in. Figured it was yours." Naomi opened the envelope. Inside was a card with no name, just a single line of elegant handwriting. "Thank you for seeing us." Naomi stared at it, confusion warring with disappointment. Fruit and bread. It was a kind gesture, but it wouldn't fix lungs. It wouldn't buy time. She felt a surge of bitterness, then immediately felt ashamed. That night, Leonard couldn't hide the pain anymore. He gasped for air, clutching his chest, and Naomi sat beside him, holding his hand, silently begging for a miracle she knew she hadn't paid for. A week dragged by, each day heavier than the last, until the bell above the diner door chimed with a sound that felt different, less like an entrance and more like an announcement. Naomi was pouring coffee, her hand trembling slightly from lack of sleep, when she looked up and froze. The couple was back, but they were not the same. The man stood tall, his hunch gone, wearing a tailored wool coat that cost more than Naomi made in a year. The woman beside him wore a silk scarf and leather gloves, her posture radiating a quiet, undeniable power. They didn't look rich in a flashy, gaudy way. They looked like people who owned the buildings the rich lived in. Grant, ever the opportunist, adjusted his sweater and rushed forward, a greasy smile plastered on his face. "Welcome back. Table for two," he chirped, his voice dripping with false hospitality. The man didn't even look at him. "No," he said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded the room. "We are here to see Naomi." Grant's smile faltered, twitching at the corners. "She's busy right now." The woman stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Naomi across the bustling room. She smiled, the same gentle, grandmotherly expression from Christmas Eve, but now it carried the weight of authority. "We can wait," she said simply. Grant hesitated, looking between the powerful couple and his waitress, then snapped his fingers at Naomi. "Make it quick," he muttered, retreating to the safety of the kitchen. Naomi approached them slowly, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt exposed, confused, and terrified. "Hi," she breathed. The man gestured to the booth, the same one she had given them before. "May we?" They sat, and the woman reached into a leather bag, pulling out a slim, black folder. She placed it on the table with a deliberation that silenced the surrounding chatter. "We owe you clarity," the man said. "For months, we have traveled to places where kindness is inconvenient. We dress as though society ignores. We watch. We wait." Naomi frowned, her brow furrowing. "Why?" The woman folded her hands over the folder. "Because we are old, and we have no children to leave our legacy to. We needed to know who would choose compassion when it cost them everything. We needed to find someone who gives when the jar is empty." Naomi's breath hitched. They knew. Somehow, they knew about the sacrifice. The woman slid the folder across the Formica table. "Open it." Naomi's trembling fingers lifted the cover. Inside were documents, crisp and official. The first page was a medical invoice from the city's best specialist clinic. At the top was Leonard's name. Stamped across the bottom in bold red ink was the word paid. All current and future treatments, the man said softly. The specialist will be at your apartment tomorrow morning. Your father will not just survive, Naomi. He will live. Naomi stared at the paper, the letters swimming in her vision as tears flooded her eyes. I can't, she choked out. I can't pay you back. The woman reached across the table and squeezed Naomi's hand, her grip warm and solid. You already did, she whispered. You paid first. Grant was hovering nearby, pretending to wipe a table, his ears straining to catch the conversation. The man turned to look at him, his gaze cold and assessing. There is more, the man said, turning back to Naomi. The folder also contains a scholarship. Full tuition, living expenses for any university you choose. The only condition is that you keep being exactly who you are. Naomi let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that turned into a sob. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Grant stepped in then, unable to help himself. Is there a problem here? The man stood up, towering over the manager. No, he said, his voice final. We're done here. And so is she. Naomi didn't leave that day in a limousine. Life isn't a movie. She finished her shift because she was responsible, but she worked with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. When she walked home, she didn't feel the cold. Leonard recovered. The treatment worked faster than the doctors predicted, fueled by the best care money could buy. Naomi went to school, studying with the same ferocity she had applied to saving those $50. Years later, at her graduation, she stood on a stage, looking out at a sea of faces. In the front row, Leonard stood, healthy and beaming, clapping until his hands were red. Beside him sat the couple, older now, but watching her with a quiet, profound pride. They had tested the world, and in a small, greasy diner on Christmas Eve, they had found gold. Naomi realized then that kindness wasn't just a soft emotion. It was a currency stronger than money, capable of buying miracles. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the smallest choice can change a destiny, please subscribe to our channel. Join us, and let's keep proving that goodness still wins.